Hi, this is Mary from the Daily Sew. You know, when you go to cut out your fabric, a lot of instructions have you fold the fabric in half, put the pattern on top, cut it out, everything's fine. But if your fabric is striped or checked or plaid, you want the stripes on both layers, because it's folded, it's got two layers, you want the stripes to line up. Because if they don't line up on both layers, you could get, all sorts of slumps or dips or whatever. It's just not going to turn out looking quite how you imagined it would look. So I'm going to show you how you can make sure your stripes, when you're cutting out your fabric, will be even. And the trick is, we're not going to cut on the fold. We're going to change the pattern piece to cut on the single layer. And I'm also going to show you how to line that pattern piece up on your fabric so that when you go to sew, your stripes will line up at the seams. So if you're ready, let's go. When you have to cut a pattern piece on the fold, as many patterns instruct you to do, especially for front and back pieces, you fold the fabric in half. If your fabric has horizontal stripes or a large print, you want the stripes or print on both layers of the fabric to line up with each other. But it's hard to know that they're lined up when you can't see what's going on the layer underneath. Even if I line up the stripes on the edge where I can see, it doesn't mean they aren't dipping down in the middle and that they're lined up or not. And if your fabric is at all slippery, like this rayon blend, it is frustrating and futile. But there's an easy solution. So patterns that need to be cut on the fold are half of a pattern. You place them on the fold so that when you cut them out and open up the fabric, you have a whole piece. So we're simply going to make the other half of the pattern so that we have a whole piece. And to do that, we need your pattern pieces that are to be placed on the fold. So if it's opaque paper pattern or if it's a tissue pattern, either one. You're going to need tracing paper. You're going to need more if you're starting with an opaque pattern than if you're starting with a tissue pattern. Make sure you can see through it. It doesn't have to be the best, but make sure you can see through it. You're going to need a pin. Make sure the pin doesn't bleed through the thin paper. Or if you prefer, a pencil. You're going to need some tape. And you're going to need something to cut out the paper with, either X-Acto knife, which is what I prefer, or scissors, either one. And you're going to need a ruler, or actually a ruler just makes it faster to trace off any straight lines on your pattern piece. You don't actually need it. So if your paper pattern is not see-through already, first thing you need to do is trace it off onto something that is see-through. When you are tracing it, make sure you also trace off any important pattern information like notches or pocket placement or darts, things like that that you will need later when you cut it out. I find dashed lines easier to trace curves. You might want to try it. When you're done tracing it off, go ahead and put in all the pattern information like the style name, the piece name, how many you need, what you need to cut it out of, and the size. So this is the line that was going to go on the fold if it was a half a pattern. And I am going to tape another piece of tissue paper or of tracing paper to that big enough, the paper has to be big enough to fit the entire pattern piece. So don't just stop at that line, but get a piece of paper big enough, or tape lots of little pieces together to get it big enough to fit your entire pattern. So tape it straight down that line. If you have a tissue paper pattern already, you're going to skip the tracing and just go ahead and start with taping down an extra piece of tracing paper to that fold line, or to that edge that goes on the fold. With the two pieces taped together, I'm just going to fold it back on the line that goes on the fold. And since I taped it there, I'm actually folding the tape. And then I flipped it over so I could see my tracing better, and cutting out both layers as if it is one piece of paper. And that's why I like to cut on the flat with the X-Acto knife. If you cut with scissors, you might want to staple both layers of the paper together so they don't shift as much as you cut it out. Be careful when we're removing the staples so that you don't tear the paper It is thin paper, it tears easily. You do not cut the fold, but you can cut off any extra fabric behind the fold. Open it up and you have a whole pattern. Make sure that you go ahead and transfer any notches to the other side of the pattern, notches, pocket placements, darts, things like that that are important to know. And now we're gonna cut this baby out. So I'm gonna lay my single layer of fabric on my table and pressed out so no wrinkles. Get it nice and even. I like to start with the front pattern piece because the front pattern piece is front and center of your garment. And I want to make sure of the bust area. I want to line it up so that there's nothing weird going on the bust area. So I look and I can move my pattern piece and so I can see through it to exactly where I want it. Now, because you want your stripes to line up on the seams, you can't just cram the pattern pieces into a little tiny bit of fabric. So take a rough look of where the front piece is going to be and try to make sure that all your other pieces fit on the fabric roughly before you start cutting out. Then when you like the placement and you know everything fits, go ahead and mark on the seam every time there is a line, or if you're dealing with a print, anytime there is an element in the print that you want to match up, mark it on the seam. You can do side seams, shoulder seams, center front seams if you have that, whatever you want to match up. Then lay your back pattern piece on top of your front pattern piece, line up the notches first, most important, and then transfer again any marks where the lines on the fabric should be or a print element on the fabric should be. Now, because these patterns are symmetrical, I've added the other half, the matching half. I only need to mark the stripes where they're hitting the seam on one side of my pattern. If I had an asymmetrical pattern, a whole pattern already, I would need to mark both the center seam and the side seams, or the side front seam and the side seam. But since it is symmetrical, I can go ahead and fold my pattern in half and then transfer the marks from where it should lay on the fabric to the other side of the pattern. And then I know exactly where to place it on the fabric when it comes to cutting it out. I've got my lines to mark up. I got my marks to line up with the stripes on the fabric. Now, when you have a pocket or a yoke or anything like that, you can go ahead and match them up. Think about how the pocket is when it's finished and look, of course, at the pocket placement on your pattern to see where it's going to go. You can match it up. You could also turn the pocket perpendicular if it's stripes, or, of course, you could put it on the diagonal. The choice is up to you. Now, remember, if you're cutting out any patterns that you have to have two of, like a side front, again, you want to cut one face down and one face up so that you have a right side and a left side pattern and not two identical pieces, especially if your fabric has a front and a back to it. When sewing these side seams, to keep the stripes lined up and matching, you want to pin every so often so that they don't shift while sewing. You could also go ahead and baste the side seam together so that it's less likely to shift, especially with slippery fabric. Or if you have a walking foot for your sewing machine, you could use a walking foot to keep them together. Just some tips for that. Well, I hope you found that helpful and that all your stripes line up nice and neatly. Now, you're not going to get, or you won't always get, your stripes to line up on the entire seam because sometimes seams curve and dip, like a center back seam of a dress that goes for a long time. But you want it to line up for the majority of the seam, or where you can. Stripes not lining up is usually found on lower cost clothing, and we know you've taken a lot of time to make your own clothes, so you might as well take just a little bit extra time and get those stripes to line up as best you can. This technique is also good for prints. I'm talking large scale prints, not little tiny prints, but prints that have large elements in it. And this is because you can make that whole pattern see-through, place it exactly where you want on the fabric so that elements in that print, on that print, don't end up in awkward places on your body. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, So this is a good way to avoid that as well. If you're interested in this top, this is a pattern by Charlotte Can, and I've put a link to her Etsy shop in the description below. There at her Etsy shop, you can purchase and download the pattern instantly. It is a beginner pattern. It is for woven fabrics like this, not for knit fabrics. I will say it is for patient beginners or people who have sewn for a while. And if you have any questions about what we did in this video today, please put them in the comments below and I'll be sure to reply. Happy sewing and thank you so much for watching. Bye. Oh, one more thing I forgot to tell you. I think it's only fair that I let you know that even though I got the stripes to line up perfectly on the sides and even on one of the shoulders, this shoulder didn't line up very well.